And don't be afraid. I won't give another presentation just right now. It will be Daniel from our university who will present something. I would just like to take the opportunity to say thank you very much to Piotr, because he, especially him, who organized and worked on this really large summer school with nearly 70 students. So I explained to you that we come from a wine area, and a traditional present for people who have done their duties and have done wonderful things are some bottles of wine. I hope you enjoy the wine. Thank you so much for your time.
During the opening ceremony, this was done by the whole team, let's say, not by me.
No, of course. but you are a leader. And this is really a leadership, and this should motivate you further, of course. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to drink.
All right. Unfortunately, we cannot go through right now, but yeah. We have to continue, so thank you very much for the opportunity to lecture here today, to be a part of this summer school. And my lecture will be about the topic, still a culture of consensus. Professor Schmidt already mentioned that it fits very well to the aspects we heard before in his lecture. So yeah, and I'll focus on the relationship between the state, business and trade unions. But and that's why I specified the title here on this slide, with a special focus on Germany, of course. All right. Yeah, thinking about the relationship between the state or government, business and trade unions in Germany in respect of the recent financial and economic crisis brings some notable events, let's say notable events and pictures to my mind. And one of these pictures I brought with me. Yeah, this picture here. And it shows the so-called, in German, so-called Konjunkturgipfel. When we translate this term, it might be best to translate with pinnacle of economic fluctuation. Yeah, and this term, Konjunkturgipfel, refers to the head or a meeting of the heads of the government, of major enterprises, financial banks and trade unions, and it took place at the Federal Chancellery in Berlin around 2008 and 2009. It was an important event in the terms of the crisis and crisis management. And why that was so, I will come back to this picture. So remind this picture, we will come back to it. Yeah, given the picture and the short description of its content, the following two questions occur. The first is the relationship between state or government, business and interest groups and trade unions in Germany in respect of the recent financial crisis and financial economic crisis. How can it be described? This is one question. And the other question is how it is connected with forward developments concerning interactions between state, business and trade unions in Germany. And these two questions in the following I will discuss, and I will discuss it exemplarily, so that means that I do not intend a comprehensive analysis. I rather go for some interesting aspects concerning these two questions. Alright, to discuss these two questions, I proceed as shown here. First of all, I clarify the theoretical background of my lecture, therefore both key assumptions of corporatism as well as the general intentions of this theory are outlined, but don't hesitate, I keep this rather short. Then in second, I will highlight some significant developments in the relationship of government actors, business interest groups and trade unions in Germany in the past. So this will be the framework for then analyzing how it was in the recent financial and economic crisis. So what was the relationship of state, business, interest groups and trade unions there. And then finally I conclude by summarizing the key findings of my lecture, and I try to give also a brief outlook on the relationship of state actors, business groups, and trade unions in Germany. All right, let's turn over to the theoretical framework of my lecture. And as I mentioned, I refer to the theory of corporatism, or as I wrote here, neo-corporatism. So why did I add the word neo? It's pretty simple. The word neo is written here in brackets just to avoid misunderstandings. Because due to the historical use of the term corporatism, it is not entirely free of negative connotations. As you may or may not know, there were dictatorships in Europe that used techniques of consensus mobilization in the 20th century. So of course this is not my understanding of corporatism. I rather refer to a, let's say, liberal and more democratic conception of corporatism, which is, I quote the German political scientist Gerhard Lehmbruch, which is an institutionalized pattern of policy formation in which large interest organizations cooperate with each other and with public authorities, not only in the articulation of interests, but in the authoritative allocation of values and the implementation of such policies. So, given that definition, we should focus on what are the main issue areas of the corporatist pattern of policy formation. And here's the hint. The corporatist pattern, first and foremost, is found in economic policy formation, especially in the domain of policies affecting the business cycle, employment, monetary stability, and the balance of trade. So to cut it short, corporatism deals with the field of macroeconomic performance. And therefore, the most important interest groups included in the corporatist pattern are organized labor and business groups, and of course the state or the government. So the central feature of the collaboration of capital and labor and the state is to improve the economic development of a state, so to say. And since these three central actors are mainly involved in the corporatist pattern of policy formation, the corporatist pattern is also known as trilateral consultations. So this is how I arranged it here, the trilateral consultations interpretation. And it is not only trilateral, but we also see here a very important, an important basis for Germany's industrial relations concerning the part of labor and business, which is called social partnership. And the basic idea of social partnership is that conflicts between labor and capital or business or enterprises, whatever you will call them, that conflicts between those two actors are generally to overcome because there is a common interest in maintaining the competitiveness of company and economy. So this is, or economy, and this is the one basic idea that's behind the concept of social partnership, which is maybe you can hear me? Yes, that's perfect. All right, and that's a major part of the whole corporatist pattern and this trilateral consultations. All right. Now, given that, it is obvious that the corporatist pattern is to divide from other theoretic approaches to the relationship between interest groups and state or government. So, or you can see here, is one approach that is to divide from the corporatist pattern. It's called the pressure politics approach. And pressure politics means that interest groups attempt to influence government actions in their particularly own agenda. So this approach involves a very instrumental understanding of the relationship between interest groups and state actors. So compared to this understanding of interest politics, so in the framework of pressure politics, corporatism theory is fundamentally different, as the next illustration shows, because corporatism theory assumes that interest groups by no means limit their action to pressure politics. However, this does not mean that pressure politics do not exist in the framework of corporatism. It is rather to define that the corporatist pattern intends that pressure politics are not the dominant pattern of interest politics. It is obvious that the relationship between interest groups and state or governmental actors in terms of corporatism is not, as we have seen in the pressure politics, unidirectional. It's rather, as I mentioned it, trilateral. So, as you can see here, that means that there's not just an increase of consultations or cooperation of government with organized interest groups, but there are also distinctive collaborations among these interest groups themselves, which I mentioned it, called the social partnership. And namely, this social partnership is realized between trade unions and employers' organizations. All right, and then corporatism theory in total understands interest groups as very important key actors in the intermediary system between state and citizenship. And that's another arrangement I have here. So why is that? Why are they so important? Well, the reason is that interest groups function as both representatives and intermediaries. So on the one hand, interest groups are getting embedded or immediately embedded, or in other words, incorporated in policymaking processes, and on the other hand, interest groups are in charge of supporting the implementation of the outcomes of those policymaking processes. So you've got the interactions between state and interest groups, which are either policy formulation, and then interest groups are mainly included in the implementation of those outcomes of the policymaking processes. So, against the backdrop of these assumptions, corporatism theory argues that the established bargaining procedures and concerted actions of government and interest groups serve to achieve or secure both social and economic prosperity by regulating conflicted issues and by concerting all the measures that are taken to deal with economic prosperity. All right. Now let's have a closer look, or a closer exemplary look, on the corporatist pattern and trilateral consultations in Germany or German politics in the past. Compared to other Western European countries, Germany does not entirely count as a typical corporatist country, but however, from time to time and due to different exogenous conditions, corporatist policy formulation was more or less a strong part, or played a strong part in German politics. For instance, in 1976, the first officially institutionalized corporatist arrangement between government, business interest groups and trade unions was established. It was called in German the konzertierte Aktion, so concerted action. And this concerted action, which was initiated by the Social Democratic Minister of Economic Affairs at that time, Karl Schiller, was considered as a suitable political instrument to overcome the first economic recession of the Federal Republic of Germany in the mid-60s. And this first corporatist arrangement was therefore established to make a substantially contribution to reduce both unemployment rates and inflation by, as I mentioned, concerting actions of the government, business interest groups, and trade unions' interests. So now we have to question, why could the Minister of Economic Affairs succeed in assembling all these actors, namely business interest groups and trade unions, to a corporatist pattern of policy formulation? Well, he succeeded mainly because different positive expectations, which were related to the concerted action in general, were present. So, on the one hand, business groups, for instance, wanted to improve the overall conditions for economic growth, whereas trade unions
among other aspects, considered the established arrangement as a chance not only to enlarge their importance as political actors, but also to realize a more fairly distribution of prosperity in German society. So the interests or the positive expectations of all these actors led to a establishment of that first corporatist pattern. But despite these different expectations that fit very well, the basic idea or the basic consensus of all the participating actors in the concerted action was to handle and positively manage the prevailing economic problems at that time. And they thought so to do this by coordinating their actions and measures concerning wage policy, investment policy, and price policy. So these were the topics and the areas they tried to concert their actions and measures. And indeed, some significant improvements of the economic situations were achieved. Due to different agreements and decisions, the rate of inflation decreased and unemployment was reduced. So, having achieved all this in the beginning of the trilateral consensus or three-party consensus, the concerted action gradually lost its importance over the time. And this loss of importance was caused by different developments that took place. At first, the number of participants was more and more enlarged. So starting with 34 people, as you can see here in this picture, from 9 organizations, the number of participants was raised to almost 80. Almost 80 participants. And the growing number of participants, of course, attended an expansion of the topics that had to be discussed and had to deal with. So therefore, the collaboration of government, business interest groups, and trade unions in this concerted action became visibly efficient. And another reason for the loss of importance is the fact that there were growing disjunctions concerning the interpretations of the economic situations between all these actors. As interests of the participating actors step by step had fallen apart, of course consensus ceased to be nearly impossible. And therefore around 1976, 1977, the first corporate arrangement therefore virtually came to an end as the trade unions decided to leave the established bargaining procedures. And the reason for this decision to leave this round was that some leading employer associations took legal steps against a law that was passed that secured the participation of employees in supervisory boards. So this was the aspect that finally took the trade unions out of the game. But although the so-called concerted action had come to an end, this did not mean that the corporatist pattern in general had came to an end in German politics. However, it became more informal and on the one hand and more sectoral on the other hand. For instance, in 1977, the corporatist pattern was successfully implemented in the sector of public health to achieve a reduction in the stabilization of costs. But I will not further focus on that development. When time goes on, difficulties of the corporatist pattern of consensus arose not until the change of government in 1982, when the coalition of Christian Democrats and liberals came to power. So why was there some problems caused by this new government? Well, it was because the coalition focused primarily on deregulation and not so much on intermediation or trilateral consensus. And therefore the relationship between government and trade unions, especially between government and trade unions, became very strained and even hostile. So during the 90s there was nearly no really trilateral consensus or trilateral consultations between some government actors, interest groups, business interest groups, and trade unions. But then some changes occurred in 1998, when the Social Democratic Party in its election campaign made the corporatist pattern to a key project for a possible government of the Chancellor candidate Gerhard Schröder. So they campaigned with this approach of corporatism to succeed in the national parliamentary election. And then they won this election in 1998 and formed a coalition with the Green Party and then Chancellor Schröder implemented the next corporatist pattern and next big corporatist pattern with the so-called Bündnis für Arbeit, best translated as Alliance for Employment. And this was established due to the fact that another crisis occurred, the labor market crisis and the crisis of the social welfare system at that time. And this alliance should overcome or develop measures and action to overcome these economic and socio-economic problems. Therefore, this alliance was established and chaired by the Federal Chancellery. So compared to the aforementioned concerted action, there were some differences and some similarities between the concerted actions and the Alliance for Unemployment. So first of all, not only they dealt with the same topics, so also both face the crisis agenda, 1998 namely labor market crisis, but they also were again established by a social democratic politician. It was Gerhard Schröder who initiated this corporate structure in German politics in the mid-60s. It was Karl Schiller, social democratic politician as well. So, given that, some observers argue that the corporatist pattern in German politics is closely linked to the governing of the Social Democratic Party. Now, I'm not sure if the governing of the Social Democratic Party is in particular a crucial condition for the corporatist pattern, but it seems obvious that a close and productive relationship between the Social Democratic Party on the one hand and the leading trade unions on the other hand helps to enhance some kind of realization of the corporatist pattern. I think this is a fact that we should remember when we go on later to the developments in the financial and economic crisis. So, as I said, besides the mentioned similarities, there were also some differences between these two versions of the corporatist pattern. And that's especially when we look on the organizational structure of these two installments. So, located at the Federal Chancellery, the Alliance for Employment was characterized by a formalized as well as hierarchical structure, limited to a rather small number of participants. So, this is the organizational structure of the Alliance for Employment. You can see we have some top-level consultations where the heads of the government, coalition, as well as the leading trade unions and employers association discuss some actions. Then we have the planning and coordination group who provide all the information for this top-level consultations. We have the so-called benchmarking group, let's say a group of experts who collected data from other countries, so to analyze how we can overcome the labor market crisis, which benchmarks are out there and maybe transferable to the German case. And we got different working groups to different topics, which under the planning and coordination groups worked on the different aspects of the crisis and maybe the actions to overcome this crisis. So it was highly hierarchical, and compared to the concerted action, it was a rather small summary of the persons to, especially at the top level, to hopefully efficiently working in this alliance. So that was a big difference between the Alliance of Employment and the concerted action. So it really seemed to be very efficient to realize a corporatist consensus between all these participating actors and authorities. Well, however, following the major part of observers, the balance sheet of the alliance was quite disappointing because the reduction of unemployment was not really accomplished, especially not accomplished by the ongoing discussions and decided actions by the Alliance for Employment. So therefore, in the end, also the alliance step by step decreased in its importance, like the concerted action in the mid-60s did. And after the national election of 2002, the alliance was not even active anymore and totally lost its importance. And this loss of importance was realized due to some different factors, and a major part played some important differences in the prevailing preferences and positions of the participating actors. And looking at that table, it is obvious that there were major differences, especially between employers and trade unions. Not so much between the government and the trade unions, so that's another hint how important the relationship between the Social Democratic Party in government and the trade unions might be. So, seeing that there are major differences, or more or less major differences between the trade unions' interests and positions and the employers' interests and positions. So therefore, an intermediation of these positions and interests in the end was too challenging not also because of the mentioned differences in interests, but also because of some general developments in the interest politics in Germany. It is to remember that the corporatist pattern requires a representation monopoly of the organized interest groups. If you claim to speak for, or decide for, or represent for specific groups of citizens in this corporatist pattern, a broad organization, a broad membership, as well as this distinct involvement of the membership is crucial. However, when it comes to membership and membership involvement in the key organization of the corporatist pattern, namely trade unions, business interest groups, there is or was a struggle for success concerning the organization and the involvement of membership. Of course, to a different extent, but substantial changes in the social-cultural environment, like individualization or Germany's reunification, lead to some problems concerning these aspects. Now, this table here shows the membership development of trade unions that are organized in the roof organization of Germany, the DGB, the German Confederation of Trade Unions. And as you see, since 2004, the DGB trade unions have lost almost 9,000 members. That means 12% of their former membership, which is a really dramatic development, or was perceived as a really dramatic development. Although different trade unions suffered from this development very differently, a loss of significant loss of members, however, always implies a loss of organizational consolidation, and that's the problem when it comes to the organization monopoly. Now, since 2009, it is to admit that the loss of members since 2009, the loss of members has slowed down, especially last year, 5 out of 8 DGB trade unions enjoyed nearly positive development of membership, as we can see here in this table. It is quite interesting and to memorize that till this day, the best organized employees in Germany are those in the metal and electric industry, which are the indicators here. So within the DGB are the industry trade union, the so-called IG Metall, at the top of this table, and the Vereinte Dienstleistungsgewerkschaft, short Verdi, which means the union of the service sector. They are similarly well organized till this day, and also similarly well organized are the automobile industry, the steel industry, and the sector of energy supply. So that's also important to remember when we focus on the crisis management 2008 to 2009. So, given that development of the trade unions, what about the business interest groups? Now, here's another table. And as you can see, compared to the trade unions, there are pretty similar tendencies in the membership development of all these different groups, and the association shows here as well. Let's focus on the total amount. I think it's best. Whereas the majority of trade unions had suffered a membership loss between 2001 and 2006, membership development also very problematic here in the business interest groups. But as well, in the last years, it seems also to be consolidated more and more. But given all these negative developments around 2000, 2004 and so on, all these reported aspects and developments have led to an erosion of the corporatist pattern in German politics at the beginning of the 21st century. Not only concern the some kind of socio-cultural surroundings and then loss of membership and so on, but also due to another development. This guy here and his reform agenda. We heard yesterday, Timo told us about the parts reforms and all the stuff. And due to this reform agenda, it was that the former relationship between the Social Democratic Party and the trade unions was getting more and more problematic. So it caused at least considerable turbulences between the Social Democratic Party and the trade unions. Why was that so? Because it was of the reform policies, of cuts in unemployment benefits, or of the policies of the expansion of the low-wage sector. So all these developments led to the development that trade unions started to estrange from their political partner, the Social Democratic Party. So therefore, the close relationship between trade unions on the one hand, the Social Democratic Party on the other hand, which is, as I mentioned to some extent, a necessity to establish the corporatist pattern, did not really prevail anymore. So to sum up, in the backdrop of all these developments, the corporatist pattern seemed to be exhausted in the beginning of the 21st century. And then, 2008, the crisis occurred. And facing the financial and economic crisis in the fourth quarter of 2008 in Germany, it was the question if this skeptical development or critical development of exhausting the corporatist pattern might continue, or could the crisis lead to some kind of revitalization of a consensus-based policy formulation like during the economic crisis in the mid-60s. So this question occurred looking at the deepening of the GDP, as we heard yesterday in the German economy. So, with contracts and production failing dramatically in 2008, the crisis indeed released some new dynamics in the relationship and interaction of government, enterprises, or employers association, and trade unions. And at this point, we come back to the picture I showed you in the beginning of my lecture. Maybe you thought, maybe he lost the picture, where is it? Now we're coming back to this picture. Because in the face of the crisis, both trade unions and business interest groups wanted state action to overcome the dramatic economic development. So there was some kind of overlapping interest right at the beginning of the crisis. But not only the economic crisis led to, let's say, a revival of the corporatist pattern of policy making, also the political situation in 2008 advanced a more coherent interaction between the state, the business, interest groups and trade unions, because there was some specific developments that strengthened or might strengthen some overlapping interests. And the following aspects are reported by Tribosch and Birke in a currently published report, and which I refer to now. So different aspects of the political situation that strengthen the corporatist pattern in the crisis. First of all, the crisis affected Germany's export economy and the metal and electrical industry, a sector in which trade unions to this day, as we see at the tables, have a relatively good position. And second, the ruling coalition of Christian Democrats and Social Democrats faced national parliamentary elections in September 2009. So therefore, it was absolutely to avoid, or the two parties, the coalition parties, had absolutely to avoid a massive increase in unemployment. looking for succeeding in a national election campaign. So therefore, the interest of the government coalition, the business interest groups, and the trade unions began to overlap again. So for instance, enterprises favored a rapid termination of the economic recession, and since a lack of skilled workers that existed already before the crisis, business interest groups had a major interest in keeping experienced permanent staff at reasonable costs. So this was the interest of the employers associations, and these interests fitted with the aims of the trade unions more or less, because the trade union for trade unions, employment security was the primary goal, even if that meant wage restrictions. So these overlapping interests were exemplarily obvious in January 2009, when the Grand Coalition had introduced 2 economic stimulus packages. And these economic stimulus packages were best known for the so-called scrappage premium. In Germany, Abwrackprämie, scrappage premium. And this term scrappage premium involved the state subsidizing the purchase of new cars when all the cars were scrapped. And it is important to know that this economic stimulus was based on a joint proposal, in other words, a consensus proposal from trade unions and the automobile industry. And another consensual measure to cope with the crisis was the government's extension of short-time working, as we already heard from Kino yesterday. And this was another development or measure that showed some kind of consensual action, because due to the approbation of both the trade unions and employers association, its duration of short-time working was lengthened. So consensus among the social partners on this issue was once more evident in autumn 2009, when the Confederation of German Employees Associations and trade unions called for another extension of these special regulations beyond 2009. So this consensus was quite near till 2009. So from what has been said, it follows that during the crisis there was a large amount of consensus, since the individual interests of the government coalition, the trade unions, and the enterprises were very similar. But however, the rediscovery of the cooperative pattern was by no means institutionalized, like the Alliance for Employment was. It happened rather situational and informal. So therefore, some observers even recognized an informal version of a new Alliance for Employment, which in their perspective was implemented by ad hoc trilateral consultations organized by the Federal Chancellery. And there we are, back at the picture, the already mentioned Konjunkturgipfel. This was the established round to maybe concerting the actions between all those participating actors. So not only did these events serve as panels to discuss further possibilities to overcome the crisis, but they moreover functioned as a highly symbolical act as well. And this symbolical act was that it should publicly craft a message that the state, the business interest groups, the financial sector, and the trade unions stand shoulder to shoulder to overcome the crisis. And this symbolical act was also mentioned by a government spokesman of the time that I interviewed. So it is to assume that this symbolic function of this event was intended in the first place, even more intended than maybe some consensus-based decisions. So remember, not only really crisis management, but also a highly symbolic act. And maybe it was this strategic intention of the coalition government that the Konjunkturgipfel lack of binding processes or structures. However, the initiated consensual cooperation was an important factor to rapidly overcome the economic crisis in Germany. And the fact that the interest of the ruling government coalition, the business interest groups and the trade unions were convergent was also, of course, a helpful condition to successfully realize a concerted action and action-based policy making during the crisis. Now, what are the conclusions of all these findings? that I reported? Well, first of all, due to its unexpected appearance, the financial and economic crisis strengthened the corporatist pattern in policy formulation. So it was the unexpected appearance and the very negative development that caused by this unexpected appearance that caused the corporatist pattern in policy formulation. So therefore the crisis was the dominant factor for rediscovery and a rather temporarily intensification of the trilateral consensus and the trilateral consultations. So since these trilateral consultations were largely limited to the crisis, in my opinion, there is no sustainable installment of a new era of the corporatist pattern in German politics. However, the crisis showed once more that the social partners, the social partnership is able, social partners are, or the social partnership is able to cope with economic shocks. I think this is an important finding as well. Now, let me finally conclude with a quotation which gets to the heart of all these final thoughts. And this quotation is also from the report of Friedrich and Birke, and it says, on balance, the period of tripartite consultation and the state intervention was limited to the active crisis management. Crisis corporatism was a relatively short-lived marriage of convenience. The period of intensive tripartite consultation was narrow, both substantively and temporarily, and largely over when the CDU-FDP, so the Christian Democrats and Liberal Party coalition, came to power in autumn 2009, which I think it's a basic finding that the era of corporatism has not received or reached a profoundly new revival, or is over the crisis dominated German politics. So thank you for the attention. Looking forward to the
Yes, thank you for the presentations. It's interesting for me to notice that the trade unions in Germany are mostly actually metal. You have the unions from private sector. In Croatia we also have, I think it's called social economic partnership or something like that, where we have the representatives of the government, of the employers and the unions, and they discuss labor law and stuff like that. And but the unions are mostly made from the public sector. And there, I don't have any empirical data, but there is a growing voice that with all of the austerity measures that they are trying to prevent, that the employees from the private sector don't have their voice. They don't have their representative. And people are getting more and more sick of the unions, so to speak. And they are losing their ground. They are using their representation, as you noticed. So just a quick remark that it's interesting that this situation in Croatia is totally different. Totally different.
Yeah, but there are some similarities, because as I mentioned,
okay.
at the beginning of the 21st century, there was highly, they were very not so much into the trade unions organization, because as you mentioned, the outcome was not as they maybe thought it was. So therefore, the loss of membership, and then the crisis occurs, and corporatist pattern revives, the revival of the corporatist pattern, with some really positive outcomes. The fact that the crisis was handled very well. So then it turns around, and the trade unions benefit from their actions in this corporatist pattern, and the membership consolidates. So maybe some kind of fluctuation. I don't know how it is in.
I don't feel like there is a consensus, like there was in your case.
Can you please comment if there is any correlation between parties and this advocacy, with the activity in the cooperation between state, capital and labor in Germany? Because you said at the beginning in history that some scholars tied SPD and with the rise of this activity, like Strudam and Bündnis für Arbeit. And then at the last slide, there was something mentioned that CDU was kind of responsible for the rise of this cooperation activity.
All right. First of all, there are some observers who formulate that indeed the Social Democratic Party in government is a crucial factor for a maybe successful installment of the cooperative pattern, which in the history of German politics, quite well occurs so that it was always the Social Democratic Party which was in charge when the big rounds, the big patterns of consensus, you mentioned the concerted action and the Alliance for Employment was established. So it occurred that there is some correlation between the Social Democratic Party and the trade unions, but also there has not affected concerning the business interest groups. So maybe this correlation cuts short, but the Social Democratic Party is a key factor to get the trade unions in the boat, I think. And this is why the agenda of Chancellor Schröder was really neoliberal and not so much on the side of the trade unions, which caused this friction and these turbulences between those two actors in the German politics. So therefore, it was really difficult in the following to realize some kind of consensus, because the trade unions said no, not with the Social Democrats, they are not on our side anymore. So and that's the point, that it was mainly the crisis and its occurrence and its negative outcome that bounded the actors back together. It was not so much the interest of the governing coalition. So as I mentioned, there were interests to avoid unemployment rates or increasing unemployment rates, looking forward to the national elections, which quite would benefit the opposition of the parliament. So it was really some kind of, not strategic, but some kind of like this, the interest of the German coalition occurred, apart from the general aim to overcome the crisis and to stop the recession. But it was mainly a crisis. There was no political interest to realize a revival of the cooperative pattern. So that's hopefully the point I can make, that in the past the crisis occurred, but there was some kind of consensus between the actors before. So and this consensus arose during the time, especially the beginning of the 21st century, and then the crisis, the main factor that brings it back in. And this is why it is obvious that after the crisis, or the deepening point of the crisis, the cooperative pattern was not around anymore, especially with the coalition of Christian Democrats and liberals. So I think there is some kind of correlation, but you have to always look at the other conditions.
Yeah. I have a question, because I'm not a specialist on this field. Why do radical forces do not have a chance in Germany? Because we could easily argue the left-wing party, the Linke. They could mobilize along these lines, especially in crisis times. They could join the radical parts of the trade unions. So they probably would pursue a course of more confrontation than of cooperation. Why is this not the case?
Maybe it is the approach of more confrontation, which some people have problems with and don't rely on such confronting issues in a time of crisis where you look for safety. So I think this is one important aspect why they did not succeed. And there are other aspects, and of course, as you mentioned, crisis times are times of the executive, of the government. So also the media focus more on the government coalition, on the Konjunkturgipfel and all stuff like that, so that the other smaller parties on the left didn't really succeed in getting their message into the media. I think that's also a very important point. But I think, of course, there are some more confrontative issues that people in terms of crisis are not so much getting into. I think they are looking for some economic knowledge, which is the main field of the Christian Democrats or the conservatives. So I think the alignment goes not so much to the smaller left-wing parties, but much more to the main actors in this political issue, mainly in the crisis, because some confrontative issues are not very successful. I think that's maybe an explanation for this development. More questions? Right, since that's not the case, again, thank you very much for the attention.